on this computer, okay. Okay, hey guys, can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay, sorry about that. Sorry about the little delay there. I had a little trouble getting booted up and ready to go here. So we'll go ahead and get started. And let me see, I'm having trouble seeing myself here. Oh, there we go. Okay, now it finally came up. So, okay, so it looks like we're all here for the most part, from what I can tell. Hope everybody had a nice Easter and ready to go for tonight. So what I'm going to do tonight is I'm going to, and by the way, I'm recording this as well, so if anybody wants the recording, they can feel free to get with me. And I'll make sure that you get a copy. But I'm trying to record all of these to the best I can, but so if you want to go back and listen to any of this, you're free to do that. But what we're going to do tonight is I'm going to just, I pretty much went over all the sort of the technical areas that really we need to go over. There are a few more graphs that we'll be covering tonight, but not much. And so it's really more based upon theory. And so theory is really what we're going to cover tonight, which is really the last chapter of the book. There are a few odds and ends from, I guess, chapter 18 that we will talk about. For the most part, I think we're done with monetary policy. Does anybody have any questions for me about anything with regard to monetary policy that we talked about last time? I know that it was a lot, and I know it was a bit involved. I have to say, it was a bit technical in a lot of ways, and so, but that is probably the most nasty it gets in this particular course. So, what I want to do now is I want to sort of finish up from where we left off last time, and I think maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we ended up talking about. I think the last thing we did was talk about some of the differences, sort of compare and contrast between monetary and fiscal policy. I believe that's where we left off from last time. There is, sorry, I'm out of camera here a minute, but there is some content in the PowerPoint package from last week about some of the recent Fed actions. And you can take a look at that for yourself. A little bit of that was probably a bit more relevant when we were still sort of coming out of the financial crisis, and the Federal Reserve was involved in lots of unusual situations, a lot of unusual monetary policy, a lot of very unusual sorts of programs like the ZIRP program, zero interest rate policy, TARP, which was very much a function of the Treasury Department, which was called the Troubled Asset Relief Program. I think your text goes into lots of detail about that. I think we're now starting to get so further enough down the road that I don't know that we really want to get into that a whole lot, but we certainly can if you want to talk about it. But they are there. And I think really what's important to know about it is if for no other reason, if it's not specific to that particular scenario back in 2008, 2009, and the years which followed, because the Fed was really busy doing a lot of things like stress tests on banks and capital requirements, and they were restricting dividends, and they were all, to shareholders and all these kinds of things. If none of that is, even though it's not very current, it might be useful to know, though, just how powerful the federal government can be, and really the success of policy, frankly. And so, I mentioned last time, I think that macroeconomists have been, for the last several years, doing an end zone dance and spiking the football and all that because of the relative success at avoiding what truly would have been a Great Depression, probably, with a bank failure and people being foreclosed on in huge percentages. It's almost impossible to believe that we could not have gotten out of that period without at least a very deep recession, which was pretty deep to begin with, but beyond that, without some sort of depression environment. So anyway, I don't count myself among the crew of macroeconomists, since I tend to be more involved in micro, particularly financial economics, but nonetheless, I think they can certainly feel good about that. So I'll let you read about that on your own, the TARP program, TALF, and all that. That's, if you want to go over that, you certainly can. What we want to do is, and I think the last couple of chapters that we're covering sort of could all be lumped together in one chapter, dealing with theory and dealing with different views of the macroeconomy over time. And why it's important is because it informs policy. Policy flows oftentimes directly from theory. And so we're going to talk about at least one theory, which is sort of been debunked over time, but just keeps rearing his ugly head again and again. We'll talk about how that kind of keeps coming up in terms of policy because of maybe wishful thinking. But the first one I want to talk about is the Phillips curve. And by the way, I forgot to mention at the outset here, we got a bit of a late start. I was sort of looking over things in my office this afternoon before coming over, and I don't think we got 3 hours of content tonight, just because of the fact that this is all that I really intended to talk about. And I emailed you earlier the slide package, the PowerPoint slides from week 7, and there's not many there. There's some pretty good content. There's not a lot there, so we may not go to 8:20. Is that going to bug anybody? You guys going to be upset and ask for a refund of tuition or anything like that? If so, I guess we can stay. The place where I taught at a university before I came to CNN, before I moved to New Mexico, where literally a faculty member let the class out like a half an hour early, and the student literally wanted a refund of credit hours, taking the whole credit hours thing very seriously, and they ended up giving it to her, which I thought was amazing in its own right. So I'm not saying that sort of legal action is going to be necessary, but I don't think we have material to go to 8:20. But I'm going to hang around anyway, just in case anybody has questions, because I will talk a bit about the final before we leave. So, okay, well, if you have questions, feel free to put it in the chat box or hit me up. I can hear you, which is good, and all that. Tonight's the last night, so we are almost done, and we can move on down the road. So, first topic I want to talk about is something called the Phillips curve. I sort of alluded to this a bit last time. In fact, maybe I outright mentioned it. The Phillips curve has been around for a very long time. It was developed by a guy named Bill Phillips back in the 40s and 50s at the London School of Economics, and he's an interesting character. He studied the British economy, studied the American economy primarily, and was interested in this idea of accelerating the economy and reducing unemployment, but in so doing, we run the risk of going too far in one direction and getting inflation as part of the bargain. We talked endlessly about that last week, this idea that maybe we're operating the economy too quickly. As a result, unemployment is very, very low. I mean, it's at least 0.5%, maybe even a full percent less than the full employment rate, the natural rate of unemployment. And so as a result, we've got about 8% inflation. So maybe we need to slow things down a little bit. And as I mentioned to you, one of the very last things that we talked about last Monday was the idea that to expect fiscal policymakers to try to hit the brakes on economy is probably too much to ask, given the fact that they're elected officials and nobody, even if they wanted to achieve that, and even try to enact it, at times they have, even saying so publicly is enough to freak out the public. So it's really up to the monetary policymakers to be able to hit the brakes. The question is to know when to hit the brakes and how much. And on the flip side of this, when the economy is going really sluggishly, unemployment is very high, and goods are stacking up on shelves. People aren't buying, so firms lower prices. So we have low inflation but high unemployment. And the question is, can we step on the gas? And if so, how much before we begin to get an inflationary situation? So Phillips curve basically looks something like this. And it doesn't matter what axis you put either one of these on, you're going to have the same relationship. And we have inflation expressed as a percentage on one axis and unemployment on the other axis. And so what have we got going on here? So Phillips basically studied the data, and what it ended up showing him was this. With some occasionally outlying data, you had sort of a downward sloping curve, looked something like that. And this was the Phillips curve. And all these individual observations could be simply the average inflation, average unemployment for a particular year for the country that was observed. And again, the UK and the US were the two that he mostly studied. And so you ended up with this inverse relationship between inflation and unemployment. And so what is this telling us? It really sort of pointed out to a lot of people. In fact, it was sort of presented when I was a young undergraduate for a very long time, the idea that it's a dilemma, and it's an unsolvable dilemma. And it will never be the case that we get out of that situation of having either one problem or the other, because here's the thing. So either we're stuck with high unemployment. So let's say we've got high unemployment, which I think most of us would say, let's say 9% would be considered high unemployment. I think most of us would agree that high unemployment is 9%. And if an acceptable inflation rate is 3%, I think most of us would probably be okay with that. Then what happens is if we try to lower unemployment by doing things like cutting taxes, increasing government spending on the fiscal side, lowering interest rates, lowering reserve requirements, doing all these things to stimulate the economy on the monetary policy side, then we can maybe bring unemployment down to something a little more acceptable, like 5%. But we might get, say, this 8% in the bargain. So as a result, one thing leads to another that it's like a whack-a-mole game. You try to deal with this problem by beating this particular thing, but then this thing pops up. So, and then you beat this, and you can reverse these arrows and say, okay, now what if inflation is a problem? And so we do things like on the fiscal side, raise taxes and cut government spending, and on the monetary policy side, raise interest rates, raise reserve requirements. And then we bring inflation down, but then we cause a recession, we create unemployment. So the Phillips curve really pointed to a dilemma, and that is, where do policymakers want to be? It's got to be somewhere in the middle between recession and high inflation. And so what it really was sort of presented as was sort of this idea that you've got sort of a dilemma, and the best you could do is sort of aim for the middle. And the problem with aiming for the middle is nobody knows really where the middle is. And let me just take this axis here as an example. I can tell you that when I was an undergraduate, the unemployment rate, the full employment rate of unemployment was thought to be 7%. 7%. Today, we're thinking it's probably more like, well, around between 4 and 5, right? Somewhere between 4 and 5 is considered the full employment rate of unemployment. And a lot of times economists will just sort of split the difference and say, okay, 4.5%. And if we're at 3.8%, that translates therefore into a high rate of inflation. But the point, back to my original point, nobody knows if is it 7 that we want to shoot for, and therefore let the inflation rate be whatever it is, as long as we get to low unemployment, or is the unemployment rate that is considered natural, and therefore the full employment rate of unemployment, which I know is a mouthful, but sometimes called the NAIRU as well, just add another acronym to the whole mix here, the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. Today about 4.5%. So this very definition of what is acceptable is unclear. Also, at one time, I can remember sometime 30 or 40 years ago, 4% inflation was considered to be ideal. And in the last, I guess, 20 years, the Federal Reserve has been trying very hard to get the rate up to 2%, the inflation rate up to 2%, because it was so low for so long. They were trying to get it up to 2%, thinking that if you get it up a little bit, maybe you'll bring some of the unemployment, which resulted from the last true recession, and the pandemic. The pandemic was sort of an interesting, unusual sort of event, but it did result in sort of a slowdown. But the Federal Reserve was trying to get that rate up. And so to 2%, so 4% would have been unthinkable, when 2% is considered to be something to achieve on a very high end, because inflation was just so very low. And I think that what's really interesting is the idea that we're now coming into this inflationary period where we've been for about a year now. And I think a lot of people are really unsure what to do about it, because I think a lot of Americans have never really lived through very high inflationary periods. And if it goes to double digits, I think that will be an entirely new experience for a lot of people as to what it means to have that. In fact, we're seeing signs all around about inflationary pressures. We need no more evidence there's inflation. I mean, the average consumer can tell you that. And this is why it's been frustrating for a lot of economists, because of the fact that the Federal Reserve and the Treasury, for that matter, have both been saying, well, inflation will go away once we get the bottlenecks in the supply chains worked out and all that. And it doesn't seem like that's the case. In fact, credit card debt and household debt is rising to very high levels, mostly because why? Let's go back to chapter 9. Remember what we talked about? One of the things about inflation is it does what? It rewards borrowing over saving. Why? Because if you're going to buy something, you're going to pay it back with cheaper dollars over time, because what is inflation other than really the depreciation value of the dollar? So this would include big ticket items, like if you're going to buy a second home, maybe now's the time to do it. You'll pay it off in 30 years with dollars. It'll be less valuable if inflation persists. And inflation, we're going to have some inflation anyway, probably. If for no other reason, then the Federal Reserve could probably manufacture it out of thin air. We'll get a bit to that later as to how that might happen. But this idea that we're seeing consumer debt start to rise again, that is something that is a little bit of an unusual phenomenon, but it's not surprising, because it's what happens during inflationary periods. If you want to make a big ticket purchase, washing machines or and washers and dryers, or you want to add on to your home, you want to buy another vehicle, You want to lock into college tuition for your kid. You know, there are like the 529 plans and whatnot. All of it sort of encourages borrowing, because if you don't have the money now, maybe you can borrow it now in order to take advantage of that. So it really points to the idea of this dilemma that as one thing goes up, the other thing goes down, and et cetera. So the Phillips curve was sort of out there and was sort of, I think, probably considered to be dogma really for a very long period of time. Here's the problem with the Phillips curve, though, and it really related to some issues that began really in the late 70s and early 80s. And that was the Phillips curve. Most people sort of accepted that, yeah, it's a thing. It's probably valid in the short run. But here's the thing, that it started to shift to the right and shift to the right and shift to the right. And suddenly, oops, we've got a problem. Because why? Well, the original theory holds that as one thing goes up, well, at least the other thing goes down. So one bad thing goes up, the other bad thing goes down. So maybe if we whack a mole and knock that bad thing down, it goes down. The other thing goes up like a teeter-totter. But here, what have you seen happening? You had a condition in which both of these variables were rising. Oops, that's not exactly how the model was supposed to work. And so as a result, the Phillips curve is thought to be valid in the short run only. So valid in the short run only. And I don't know if I mentioned it in the slide package. Valid, and the reason why was because of a phenomenon which was noticed back in the really early 80s, and that was this idea of a shift to the entire function in a phenomenon known as stagflation. Stagflation, which is basically a sort of a made-up word, a wonky made-up word that stands for stagnant economy with inflationary conditions. It's really the worst of both worlds, isn't it? Because it'd be one thing to have low inflation and low unemployment. Nobody would complain about that. Everyone would be happy if the curve shifted this way, right? In fact, if anything, it might even sort of vindicate the nature of policy in general, that we can cure all things, right? But no, this was the worst of both worlds, because not only did we didn't get the bargain that said we can hit one thing down and at least have to deal with, at least fix that, and then we have the other problem to deal with. Here we've got both problems to deal with in a stagflationary condition. And I can tell you that supposedly, and I have no firsthand knowledge about it, but supposedly it was such a serious problem in economics profession, this idea of stagflation, that textbook publishers, macro publishers, decided they were going to require economists to figure this out before they published any new macro text, because this did not appear to have validity, particularly in the long run. Now, today, the Phillips curve is still out there. We still teach it because it really does have short-term validity. As I said, I mean, this is a perfect case in point right now. We get very low unemployment and very high inflation. So I think it does hold in the short run. There have been articles that I've seen, and unfortunately, I read more than my share of business and economic articles, some fears that maybe we get stagflation arising again. I don't really think that's so much the case. And one of the reasons why, I think, is because, number one, I think the explanation, there's been a lot of research that's been done in the last 40 years since this time happened. And one of the things that is noticed is that the stagnant part of the inflationary piece is, in other words, where's the chicken and egg on that causes the rightward shift? And the chicken is, well, I guess you can't say chicken and egg because that doesn't make sense. It's what starts the first thing off, right? Because it looks like a chicken and egg, because inflation, unemployment, you got both of them together. So what caused it? And I think you can say inflation caused the stagnation, mostly because once inflation got to be very, very high, business firms decided that they didn't know what to invest in. They didn't know, what kind of products were going to sell. They didn't want to make any long-term commitments because they didn't know what expenses were going to be, what wage costs were going to be, what it's going to cost in things like materials cost. And so it's sort of a rule of thumb, if you're a cautious and conservative business, why do anything at all if you don't know what you're facing? Because forecasting is a pretty critical element of that. And I know you all gone through the fast track program and are now familiar with SWOT analysis. You probably heard that more than what you ever wanted to hear, SWOT. And that is the whole strategic analysis. And if you don't really know what's coming, or can't really tell what's coming, then you may not want to do anything at all. And so as a result, you're going to pull in your horns, which means unemployment's going to go up while we still have the inflation. Because why do we still have the inflation? Because inflation is considered to be a monetary phenomenon. And that is something that we'll talk just a bit more about here in a second. So excuse me just a second. I'm going to plug my computer in before I lost my juice on my laptop here. So Somebody said what I was thinking here, but laptop losing power. So let me see. Okay, so that's the Phillips curve in a nutshell. This idea of stagflation. In fact, there was some work by, I believe he's a Canadian. His name is Robert Mundell. He ended up winning a Nobel Prize for the idea that you can actually reverse this and push this to the left as long as you control this thing right here, inflation. And over many years, I think it's been sort of understood, at least assumed, that the Federal Reserve has got a default setting of dealing with inflation first as the primary problem versus that of unemployment. I think that's probably safe to say. Now, is that fully agreed upon? Does everybody agree that that's the Fed's position? Well, and I know it sounds like a cold-hearted position that we want to deal with inflation. So if there's anything we're going to sort of push down on this axis and let this axis deal with its own problems, maybe it does sound a little bit cold-hearted from the standpoint of criticizing the central bank. The last few years, though, I think it'd be really hard to sort of make that argument, particularly as inflation is beginning to rage and we've got very low unemployment. And the Federal Reserve has pretty much not done much other than say, well, we're just going to wait and see because we think that the inflationary situation is going to correct itself. And it reminds me, I was having a discussion with somebody else, and it reminds me a little bit of somebody who goes to the doctor and say Halloween, and the doctor says, you really need to lose weight, you should lose this much by whatever. And the person says, okay, that's great, I'll do it just as soon as the holidays are over. So anytime they go through Thanksgiving and Christmas and New Year's and all that, anytime they go back to the doctor in January, now the problem is worse. And so now you're gonna have to lose even more weight, you're gonna have to do more exercise and eat even less or whatever, and it's gonna be more difficult. And I say this only because the Federal Reserve was pouring on stimulus into the economy even while the inflation rate was rising. And the Federal Reserve, Jerry Powell, Jay Powell, the Fed chairman, had a press conference back in the fall who said, well, we're going to stop buying bonds, putting money in the economy, but we are going to raise interest rates probably sometime next year. So they weren't really in a particular hurry. And I think the evidence is very clear that they probably should have been in a bigger hurry because inflation is threatened to be something of a problem. And I say threatening, a lot of people probably need no convincing that it is a problem whatsoever. So anyway, we talk about the Phillips curve. It's not been completely debunked because of the fact that it does seem to have short-term validity. The problem is, in the long run, it could be potentially problematic if, in fact, there is lots of inflation that goes on, or there is the existence of stagflation. Okay. All right. So questions for me about any of that? Okay. Feel free if you do. I know I can see if you make a note in the chat box, you could do that, or I can hear you, whichever you prefer. You guys are a little bit quiet. Where's my eraser? Oh, there it is. It's over here. So let me go on to. And I apologize for moving out of the camera here. I know this is not the way you would do it on TV, continually leaving the camera, but there's only one board space here to work with. So I want to talk about monetary theory, and it kind of comes up, and it's your textbook sort of brings it up in connection with monetary policy, because remember, when we talk about, what did I say at the outset, that theory is important because it informs policy. And this is really one of the big reasons why we study macro in the first place, but because it really informs policy much more than micro, I think. And I don't know if anybody's here has taken micro before, but if you go on to take a bachelor's program in business somewhere, you undoubtedly will have micro, and it's a lot less theoretical than macro is. Not that there's zero theory, but there's certainly a lot in macro in dealing with theory, and that's what we're sort of segueing into here. And really, the main segue is that of monetary theory and what to do about the money supply. So it's really something of what we call the classical school. We'll talk a little bit more about who they are and what their historical legacy is and all that. But sort of the high priest of this is Milton Friedman. And what are some of the tenets? That government spending is inherently inflationary. Now, in other words, government spending is a function not of what? Not of monetary policy, but of fiscal policy. So there's inherently, right off the bat, a critique of fiscal policy as being somewhat weak, somewhat ineffective. And by the way, it's almost always inflationary. And so what good is fiscal policy? And in fact, I bring up Friedman a lot because he was far and away the most prominent of the monetary theorists In fact, in the time in which he was most active, that was the 50s and 60s and 70s, he was probably far and away the most famous economist in America in those days. He actually had a TV show, which, can you imagine an economist with a TV show? That would be a fairly crazy thing to see today. But he did have a TV show on PBS, and I mean, a lot of these critics say, well, it's just a way that Hawkey's book of the same name is called Free to Choose, but he was very big in economic freedom. And among the issues of economic freedom that he talked about were freedom from government intervention in the economy, which he likened to being tantamount to interference. And Friedman, had a lot of criticism of government in general, and it wasn't just fiscal policy. He even had lots of criticism of monetary policy, particularly given that he was a scholar of the Great Depression. In fact, was around for the Great Depression. He was a very young economist in the Roosevelt administration. He just died a few years ago, so he's a very elderly person. But he talked about the idea that the Federal Reserve did all the wrong things and none of the right things, and went so far as to say that there would have been no Great Depression in the 1930s at all had we not even had a Federal Reserve, which is a pretty astounding statement for a guy who considers himself a monetary theorist, that is, one who's concerned about developing monetary policy. But I think his point was that if government exists to do good things, but if they're going to do bad things, we don't really need them at all, and we're better off not having them. And so that was his criticism of that specific instance of monetary policy. Not in general, but he does reserve the general criticism for fiscal policy, which he says is full of politics, which no one can deny that's impossible. They're spending on programs which have no bearing in terms of need or whatever. I mean, there were a lot of critics of like the space program in the 1960s. We spent billions of dollars, went to the moon, we got there. Okay, a bunch of rocks here, and then we came back and all that. And now I don't agree that it was not a worthwhile spending of money, but you get the idea that there was a lot of criticism of that, and particularly criticizing one of the main theorists of the other school, who basically said it doesn't matter what government spends money on as long as they're spending money and putting money out and playing the economy. And it sounds like wasteful government spending to those in the monetarist side of things. Friedman had a way of sort of getting under people's skin in a lot of ways. I think he enjoyed it, but he even said that, look, government often does that. The worst evils that are ever perpetrated by mankind are done by governments. And he even said that the Holocaust was a government operation, which I guess it is, and that was maybe a little bit preaching a little bit too hot for a lot of people. But in fact, how do you argue with that? A Jewish man who was criticizing a government operation which was among the most deadly. So yeah, it comes on a little bit strong. I get that, I understand that. However, he was a very great theorist when he talked about the idea of what is important in terms of monetary control. And he repopularized something called the quantity theory of money. So the quantity theory of money it actually has been around for a while. And I don't recall if I was talking to this class about it, but I was doing I came across an article on the history of the quantity theory of money, because I know that Friedman sort of rejuvenated this and made it popular again, but it had been around at least since the 18th century, when economists were first beginning to practice. Early economists like David Ricardo and I think that even Thomas Malthus were talking about the quantity theory of money. Malthus was really worried about population growth and food supplies and all that, and wondering how on earth we would ever feed a rising population, given the fact that we just simply couldn't print money because it would be inflationary as part of the bargain. But then I ran across an article that says, in this article, it said that it might have gone back to, I think it was Galileo, the scientist, who was interested in the quantity theory of money, which that I was not prepared to read. But anyway, the idea is that the money supply makes a difference. And so there's a very famous theory called the equation of exchange. And it basically looks like this. It's called MV equals PQ. Sometimes you'll see and by the way, there are all kinds of variations on this particular formula. Sometimes you'll see this expressed as MV equals PY, because what is P times Q is what? P times Q is basically the idea of GDP in general, right? So this would be nominal prices times the quantity of goods. Well, that's GDP, right? So sometimes you'll see it that, or you take real GDP or real price level times all of GDP and you get GDP. So sometimes if you just get rid of that and just say this is real GDP and this is nominal GDP, then MV equals Y. So there are all kinds of variations. I only bring this up because of the fact that you do see numerous variations on this particular formula, but this is the one that we tend to see the most often, and it's MV equals PQ, which is basically what? It's not anything more complicated than going back really to the circular flow model that we discovered back, I think, in week 1. This is the money side of the economy, right? This is the money economy. This is the money economy here. Remember the green arrows in the circular flow model? And what is this thing over here, but really the quote unquote real economy, right, of goods and services. In other words, the financial flow and the physical flow, to bring it back to the parlance of the circular flow model, which I know we continually refer to again and again, but it is good to illustrate what's going on in the economy. So the real economy is basically all the output of goods and services is simply all goods that are produced times the prices of those goods. And then this should then mirror or be equal to the money supply. So the supply of money times the velocity of money. No, this is the only one that we haven't defined yet. Velocity is defined as the number of times that money turns over in a given year. It's called the velocity of money. And what it means is that it's something we all know, that money is recyclable. So the dollars in your pocket or your wallet or your purse today are going to be in someone else's wallet next week. They're going to be in a cash register the week after that. They're going to be in some bank vault 2 months after that. So it moves, money moves. So if you have a $21 trillion economy, that is all the goods and services times their prices, which is about, say, $21 trillion, you don't need or want $21 trillion of money supply floating around out there. You want something less than that because those dollars are going to keep turning over, if that makes sense. And so here's the thing about the MV equals PQ formula that is very important, because it's really, remember what the monetarists are concerned about was monetary expansion simply to support fiscal irresponsibility, I guess you could say, is what their main concern was. And so the question is, why do we have inflation? In other words, what's going on here to cause inflation? So just to sort of recreate this over here, the explanation is this, and the assumption is this. If velocity is considered to be stable, okay? If velocity is considered to be stable, okay? And the quantity of goods produced is considered to be stable, then how do we explain a rise in the price level? And the only way to explain a rise, if these two guys are stable, whatever they are, they're rising, but they're stable, then how do you explain a rise in the price level? The only way to explain it is an increase in the supply of money. It's the only way that you would be able to explain why you have inflation in the first place. It's because of excessive money growth. And that is considered to be the problem with inflation, is the idea that inflation is a monetary phenomenon. And so Friedman himself was famous for saying money matters, and sort of that's sort of a something everybody can sort of get behind as a general proposition, but he really means it more in sort of a macroeconomic sense, that the supply of money matters. And so as a result, if you limit the supply of money, then you could potentially head off inflation before it ever begins in the first place. And so that's really a key point with regard to monetary theory. And again, it sort of fits in this broader school of what we now refer to as the classical school, which is what we will talk about now. So, by the way, and I don't know if I covered this on the second slide package that I just sent out. Well, when I say second, I guess the one for let me see here real fast. If I talk about something called the K% rule, let me just see real quickly here. Monetary. Oh, I did not. Okay, I did not. So, real briefly here, so what's the question here? What's the solution to this? And Friedman's solution was something called the K% rule. The K% rule. And let me just step back a minute and talk about what rules-based policy is versus its opposite, which is considered discretionary policy. And I think your book has an interesting discussion about these particular differences. When we talk about policy, and we've said this again and again throughout this term, we're talking about government policy, because in macroeconomics, there's only one actor that matters when it comes to devising policy to deal with macro problems, and that's government. And so government would tend to have two approaches to dealing with any particular policy. That is, develop a rule that says, if this happens, then do this. Almost like computer programming. If inflation does this, then we do this. Or if unemployment does this, then we do this. And so rules-based policy basically said, it lays out a formula, it lays out a a set of rules for what to do. This differs from discretionary policy that says, we will deal with problems as they come about, both fiscal and monetary responses, and we can't know, we don't have the wisdom to know what something is going to look like 10 years from now, and we don't want to be stuck with some sort of formula that we are sort of dealing with in order to sort of deal with problems. And by the way, when we talk about rules-based theory, it tends to be, and I know that some of these are going to sort of verge into politics, but we talk about the monetarism tends to be more associated with conservative politics. I think that's probably safe to say. And rules-based policy tends to be considered more with sort of conservative, political orientations as well. I think that's probably a safe bet. There is one rule that's been very much in discussion for a long time. It's called the Taylor Rule, developed by John Taylor, who's still around, still going strong at Stanford. And he's got really a tool for how to deal with inflation also, but it deals primarily with interest rates, not money supply. But given the fact that money supply and money supply and interest rates are intricately linked, there is sort of a connection there anyway. And if you're really interested in that, we can talk about it, but I don't know that anyone is. So what is this K% rule that Friedman came up? And by the way, what is K? If K is a variable that talks about some percentage gross, percentage something, then what is K? And Friedman says, I don't know what K is, but I just know that if we set a rule and we find out what works, then we'll just go with that and use that. Now, he did throw out the idea of 3% GDP, 3% monetary growth. The percent here relates to the percentage of the money supply that would increase over time. So if you increase the money supply by only 3%, then you should really get no more than 3% inflation per year. The reasoning being, how could you get higher inflation if you've restricted the growth of the money supply to some percentage, which we'll say it's 3%. Likewise, how do you get a downturn in the economy when you got continually monetary growth being pumped out there all the time? And so as a result, it was an effort to try to deal with both inflation and unemployment by asserting that you can simply adopt a rule that will solve the problem. Now, I don't know that the Federal Reserve has ever really latched onto it. In fact, I can tell you that when Alan Greenspan was the chairman of the Federal Reserve, and I saw on a symposium with John Taylor, who has sort of a variation of this, but it's different. He deals interest rates, not money growth. And Greenspan, who by then had retired and all that, but he said that I don't think your rule is going to work. It assumes the world is always going to be the same way, and all we have to do is simply, why do we need policymakers if all we need are rules, right? In fact, why do we need anybody to do anything if we can simply program everything to work based upon what we think is going to happen, and when this happens, then automatically this happens, that sort of thing. So I think that was a criticism that I was a little bit surprised to see that, because you tend to think of Alan Greenspan as being fairly conservative. He's usually aligned himself, even in his long career prior to becoming Federal Reserve Chairman, he's aligned himself with the Republican Party. He was President Ford's economic advisor. So it was interesting to see that. But so this whole idea of rules versus discretion is an interesting debate. There are people who really hold hard and fast to the rules-based rule of the road. There are others who think that it's not particularly feasible. And again, all I'm trying to do in the theory part of this class is sort of to present the ideas. I don't really even want to get into sort of my particular views. I mean, I guess I can tell you what I think, but I don't know that anybody cares what I think. And it doesn't really make any difference anyway. But instead, just sort of let you maybe germinate and just maybe rattle around in your brain for a while and see what you think about some of these, particularly as to the role of government. Because the role of government, as we weave our way throughout this whole discussion of theory, the role of government is central to almost every discussion. That is, what is the proper role of government, if there is a proper role of government in each and every area of economic life? And if so, what is the proper role? What should it be limited to? When should government back away and let the private sector do its thing? So let's talk about these schools of thought. I sent out this final package to you. It dovetails pretty nicely. In fact, there's a nice little sort of matrix in your text. I don't have the book open with me. I should have probably flipped that page open. But where it's got the schools sort of laid out, it's also got some of the variations of the classical school, which I'll talk about here in a minute. We talked about the monetarist a bit. But let's talk about the schools of macro thought that have developed over the time. And macroeconomists today sort of situate themselves in one of these two schools, which is not to say that you can't have some agnostics who take a little bit of this and take a little bit of that and sort of choose what they like and whatnot. But for the most part, I think most macroeconomists would consider themselves either Keynesians or or quote unquote neo-Keynesians or classicists or quote unquote neoclassicists. And let's talk about the first one, because that's really the beginning school, and that's called the Keynesian School. So we haven't talked very much about the work of the economist John Maynard Keynes, who, along with Friedman, probably there are two of the leading lights in macroeconomics, among many, because there are several that I'll mention here in my slides. But John Maynard Keynes was probably the world's first true macroeconomist, actually. In fact, it's been said that the word macroeconomics didn't even exist until sometime even after the Great Depression was over, because nobody really knew that you needed a separate way to deal with the economy as a whole. And prior to that, if you'd taken an econ class in the 1920s or 30s, it would probably have been mostly a micro class dealing with supply and demand, and that the macroeconomy itself was mostly just a collection of individual markets and individual actors doing their thing. And as a result, that's what makes an economy. But Keynes was saying, no, there's something more to this. We need to look at the big picture, because yes, we can drill into individual markets and see what motivates producers and consumers and workers and employers. But really, there are things like interest rates and money supply, and the price of money makes a big difference. Tax rates. These are things that, if they get factored into micro models, they're really secondary to a lot of what's going on. So Keynes was taking a step back. His major work was published in 1936. It was called The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money. I have read it all the way through once, and I've read bits and pieces a number of other times. It's a difficult read, I have to tell you. Somebody bought this for me for Christmas, and as I got into it, I thought maybe they were trying to pull one over on me, knowing how difficult this book is to read. But Keynes wrote this really in the middle of the Great Depression. And because he was saying, look, policymakers worldwide are floundering. This depression has been going on now for years. And that furthermore, existing theory tells us that markets should be in equilibrium or work their way back to them, but they're not. Markets are getting stuck. And this whole idea of stickiness is really sort of a key thing that comes up again and again in Keynes' sense of theory. And so Keynes is saying, okay, things get stuck, and as a result, we can't get ourselves out of a depression. And because if we could, we would have done that. And so the word classicist itself was really coined by Keynes, and this is how audacious Keynes was. He basically said, everybody who's written before me they were all a little bit wrong, and we're going to sort of lump them into the group that we'll call the classical school of economics. And the classicists themselves have sort of rejuvenated that. They sort of appropriated that term for themselves. It was pretty audacious to say that everything before me was wrong, and this is the way the world works. There aren't very many thinkers who can get away with that. Keynes was one, certainly in econ. I can't think of anybody else in econ who's ever done that. Maybe Einstein in physics. But it's this idea of saying you've got to look at the whole and what to do about it. And so when we talk about the Keynesians, and by the way, the neo-Keynesians have sort of taken to call themselves mainstream economists, because for many years, I'd say probably beginning in the 1970s, when we had massive inflation, Keynesianism was sort of coming on hard times. It really was. And the classical school was sort of rejuvenating. And in fact, I had a professor in college, maybe more than one as an undergraduate, who said that really Keynes was mostly a dead letter because he was primarily a depression theorist. And outside of depression, he doesn't have an answer for inflation. He doesn't have an answer for stagnant economies in the very long term. All he could deal with is these very short-term conditions. So you get the idea that he came on some hard times. However, since about I'd say the recession about 2001, 2002, the Keynesians are kind of like Carrie in the movie where she kind of comes back from the dead, right? They kind of crawled back out of the grave and they're alive again. And they've been making their presence known, and they're very prominent, to the point where the classicists are sort of now maybe retreating in their shell a bit because of the resurgence of Keynesianism. So let's talk a bit about Keynesianism and what it's about. And I know that this would have been an easier bit to discuss had we done chapter 11, because what chapter 11 really does is take the model that Keynes described. He didn't do the graphics on this, that came a bit later by another economist named Hicks, but he did talk about what to do about an economy that was was operating below full employment. And he was saying that, look, if you just take this where you got full employment here and the actual is here, you've got a gap. Well, you've got to get from here to here somehow. And how do you do that? Because you've only got consumers, businesses, and government. And if consumers don't want to spend or can't spend, and businesses don't want to spend or can't spend, there's only one left to do it. That's government spending. And so you've got to get government involved in spending money. And the governments in the 1930s did not want to spend money. In fact, they didn't want to go into deficit spending. Obviously, something which they overcame in later years, clearly. But they did not want to spend and go into deficits. Today, the government would certainly do that without even a second thought, but to go into deficit spending. So, I mean, can you imagine that? So, government spending, even if a deficit is created, was the answer to creating this. In fact, Keynes went so far as to talk about the fact that government can. He was asked, "Well, what should government spend money on?" He said, "It doesn't really matter." And in fact, he came up with a sort of ludicrous example in the general theory where government was to bury a bottle of diamonds, and I don't know where he gets this wacky idea of a bottle of diamonds in a mountain, and firms can, whoever can dig in the mountain and find a bottle will reap the reward, and therefore they'll pay their workers, and they'll all share in the value of that, and that will stimulate the economy. Now, I don't know if he was being mostly sarcastic or what, but what he did say was it doesn't really make any difference what government spends money on. In fact, maybe it's better to spend money on something valuable like bridges and canals and dredging ports and all that, which eventually was done by the Roosevelt administration in this country. A lot of the, like the Hoover Dam was a Depression era project. The Golden Gate Bridge, the Bay Bridge in both in San Francisco were those projects that were done during that time. Bandelier National Monument was part of the whole, and there were just a lot of different projects that put people to work right away in order to, and with government spending, so that businesses and individuals could then carry the ball. In other words, working through the multiplier, you just need to get from here. You don't need to get here to here. You just need government to get from here to there. So delta G only needs to get you part of the way, and then the multiplier will carry you the rest of the way on its own. Okay, and then that's where the multiplier idea really started with Keynes, and he's talking about this idea of successive rounds of transaction. But government was needed to create the jump start. The economy needed to be jump started, and government spending was the only sort of means in order to make that happen. And so it was really a set of influential theories for a very long time. These are sometimes known as saltwater economists, mostly because of the historically they've tended to be populated some of the on both coasts. And so when we talk about Keynesian theory, what are some of the main tenets of that? Unlike, and by the way, there's also a slide that talks about the tenets of classical theory, which almost all of these items are going to be sort of inverse to one another, which is problematic when you consider the fact that both of these groups are still out there and fighting it out in the public realm. It'd be very nice if economists could agree on things, and there are a lot of things people agree on. So I know that the statement that was made back when I was a student that Keynesianism is dead was probably very premature, because I don't think anybody would have thought that we would have had recession after recession toward the end of last century and into this new one. That needed government intervention, and that because of government intervention, the unemployment rate never really got anywhere near some of the highs of what we would consider to be a depression. So heading that off, I think, was really a success story for government. So anyway, what are some of the tenets? Economies are inherently unstable, and that unlike the traditional thinking that said that economies are either at full employment or are moving that way, that they can get stuck in full employment, and that the sticking is what he would call underemployment equilibrium. Among all the numerous automotive metaphors that we've talked about, even up to this point, the analogy is the economy is in first gear. I mean, you could drive, if you have a stick, you can drive a car in first gear, you can drive it indefinitely, I suppose. But what's the problem with that? You're not going to get there very quickly. You're not going to get there very efficiently. And I would dare say you're probably going to do some long-term damage to the vehicle, I would think, by driving in first gear all the way to Santa Fe or Denver, wherever you want to go, right? So as a result, you need something to step up the gear. You need to step up the gears somehow, because it's not going to happen on its own. You need some sort of mechanism, outside agent like the government in order to do it. So economies are not self-correcting. And by the way, when Keynes talks about the classicists, all of whom came before him, like Marshall and Ricardo and Smith and all these others, he basically said that they all sort of believed that the macroeconomy was like individual markets, where if individual markets get knocked out of equilibrium for whatever reason, they'll find their way to a new equilibrium fairly quickly. In fact, back in chapter 3, when we did like shifts in demand, shifts in supply, we're basically saying if there's a rightward shift in demand, we have an increase in quantity supply, or an increase in quantity, an increase in equilibrium price. It happens like more or less instantaneously. Well, really, there's a process by which they work their way to a new equilibrium. And this idea of working away, it was a more of a technical nature that wasn't really necessary to talk about. But the idea was that the economists prior to Keynes were saying, well, if there's an adjustment where the economy's out of whack, it will work its way back fairly quickly. Because why? If there's a recession, workers will take lower wages. And so firms that would hire 10 workers maybe can hire 15 workers by paying them all less. And as a result, once they start to spend, the economy begins to improve, then maybe wages can go up as the economy goes up, et cetera, et cetera. Keynes was saying not so fast. First of all, he talked about this idea that workers don't like to take wage cuts, which I know is not exactly earth-shattering news that workers don't like wage cuts. But he talked about something that is really, was not very comfortable news for a lot of people to hear, and that was the idea that a business firm puts that proposition to workers. If right now, let's forget about collective bargaining, because that really wasn't so much a thing back in the 1930s. Let's forget about collective bargaining arrangements, which, by the way, they're not so much of a thing now anyway, because of the sort of the demise of unions. But if a firm said to its employees, okay, there are 200 of you, I've got bad news, we're going to have to lay 50 of you off because of the fact that we're having hard times. And obviously that's not good news. And people say, well, I don't want to get laid off. Or they could say, or everyone could take a 5% cut in pay and we'll keep everybody on the payroll, or 10%, or whatever the figure is. And what is very often happening is the Keynes foretold this. The workers who have been there longest and most seniority are most valuable will say, you know what, let 50 go. I don't want to take a wage cut. So we much prefer that the workers who've got more seniority, more experience, know what they're doing, let the people who've been here 6 months go. Why should I take a pay cut because you're accommodating someone who just got here, type of thing? It's pretty harsh. It's pretty harsh rhetoric. This idea of what he calls insider-outsider relationships. That is the idea that if people who've been at firms for a long time are insiders, those who just got here 6 months ago are outsiders, and so outsiders, they should go while we reap the benefits. This has got enormous implications everywhere in economics, particularly in labor economics. This idea of insider-outsiders. And it works in so many different areas. I mean, even the professions have tried to keep people out for years. Why is it hard to get into medical school? Because the medical profession doesn't want everybody and their brother to be a doctor. If that were the case, nobody would pay doctors big wages in order to do that. That's why it's hard to get in medical school. They don't want everybody to be a doctor. There are certain professions that are almost impossible to get into. Actuarial science, I had an interest in it one time, and it's a high-paying profession. They go out of their way to make it difficult for you to get into the profession, having to take 10 professional exams. It's like taking 10 bar exams or 10 CPA exams just to keep you out of the occupation. So inside and outside relationships, this issue of wages and dealing with unemployment and getting back to full employment, that was only really scratching the surface of that. Because what he's really talking about is the fact that instead wages will get stuck at a high level. They won't adjust and they won't hire more workers because firms will simply lay off the least productive employees. So therefore, unemployment won't cure itself because of that. And so as a result, government should do something to deal with those who are unemployed. What else? That economies are not self-correcting. Aggregate demand and aggregate supply are inherently unstable. And as one thing I mentioned is you can't count on the private sector, that is households and government, to do the spending necessary. And by the way, aggregate demand is very much extolled as being the most important part of the economy. By the way, we had a discussion question last week about which was more important, aggregate demand or aggregate supply. It might have been 2 weeks ago, actually. And I said the question is going to be important because it's going to come up again when we talk about theory. And that is, if we're trying to manage an economy, do we lean more toward favoring the demand side and adopt policies that are favorable to the demand side, or do we adopt policies that are more favorable to the supply side? And it sounds maybe arbitrary. And I know most of the class came down on the side of supporting the supply side, which is interesting because classes are a little bit different. Sometimes a lot of people will be split both ways, or a class will be heavily geared toward the demand side. So it's a difficult question. And it sounds very much like and they're relevant, like a question with no answer. And by the way, a lot of the discussion questions don't have any really one right answer. Instead, what it's intended to really do is raise more questions. And that's a lot of what we're really trying to do is what we're trying to answer stuff for sure. We're also trying to raise some questions, and that is, it really forms the basis of policy. So Keynesian theory really was a demand side theory, which again, it opens it up to lots of criticism, I guess you could say, about that particular theory. So higher government spending can bring about full employment, and that monetary policy is really oftentimes ineffective at boosting aggregate demand. And one of the reasons why Keynes talked about, which by the way, I think has really sort of worked its way, monetarists themselves and classicists themselves sort of agree with this, and that is that monetary policy to boost the economy is oftentimes less effective than monetary policy to slow the economy down, because monetary policy that boosts the economy has to rely upon what? Money creation and the actions of private actors. Well, first of all, firms to invest, right, and borrowers to borrow, but also banks willing to lend, and you can't make banks lend if they don't want to. And that's really a truism. Back during the 08-09 recession, I guess it was still probably 08 because it was President Bush's Treasury Secretary. It used to be at Goldman Sachs. I forget his name now, but it'll come to. It wasn't Snow. It was the guy who came after him. Who said, "Look, if banks don't want to lend money, I'm not going to make them lend money if they don't want to." So, I mean, I thought that was a rather extraordinary statement. So it's been likened to pushing on a string. You know, how do you push a string? You can pull a string, slowing things down very quickly, but pushing on a string makes it quite difficult to do. So you get the Hank Paulson, that was his name. I knew his name was on the tip of my tongue, Hank Paulson. So I can't make banks lend, so it's pushing on a string. So monetary policy, from the standpoint of a theory which is based upon stimulus and stimulating demand side, is not very effective. Fiscal policy is, because the government can spend money very quickly. And so discretionary policy is the preferred method. Okay. And then furthermore, to sort of get the theoretical underpinnings of this a little bit more workout here, when Keynes talked about the aggregate supply curve, if you haven't had enough of the PY plane yet, I've got one more model for you, and that is this. We've seen aggregate supply in the short run look like this, upward sloping. We've seen it in the long run look like this. What we haven't seen is aggregate supply look like this yet, but aggregate supply in the short run, in the Keynesian view, is considered to look like this. And that is the idea that what? If you've got GDP, whatever it is, Y1, Y2, Y3, but full employment somewhere out here, right? It doesn't make any difference how much you stimulate aggregate demand in order to raise GDP. You'll raise GDP while the price level will not change. So you can do it without inflation. So P, what is simply called P bar, that it won't change. It's like, oh my God, we have a vertical aggregate supply curve. Now we got a horizontal aggregate supply curve. What Keynes is really saying is the idea that you can stimulate the economy, particularly if you're well below full employment. And because why? Because firms don't have any pricing power when buyers aren't buying. Workers don't really have that much wage power, despite the inside and outside relationships. They can't raise their wages. All they can do is prevent wage cuts. So we say they're downwardly inflexible. It's the ratchet effect, right? It also works with wages as much as it does with prices. You might recall that downward inflexibility. So there's no pricing power, and as a result, you can boost the economy without creating additional pressures on prices. Okay, so that's Keynesianism in a nutshell. You know, there's a lot going on in the general theory. It's a difficult read. I got to tell you. I mean, he puts some algebraic symbols for things that have no bearing. He'll say that what's called A inventory. It's like, what? I mean, okay, whatever, you know. And so, and he'll go on and talk about something, he'll come back and talk about A again. It's like, what was A? I forgot, you know, what is inventory? Okay. You know, it's just difficult. And he writes in sort of this Victorian manner, where they use a lot of terms like, it's not unlike, and we're not unlike, okay, you know, that sort of thing. So it's, he's difficult. And at one point he gets into a section on finance and interest rates and all that, which doesn't have much to do with the fiscal issues which he was talking about. But nonetheless, it did form really the basis for an entire school of thought. Keynes would have probably undoubtedly won a Nobel Prize, but he died before the Nobel Prize in economics was around. And so he did not, but he, even 20 years after his death, his face was on the cover of Time magazine because of the fact he was so influential at really rewriting the rules of economics. That is the idea that if we have unemployment, we can solve it simply by increasing government spending. Even if we have to go into debt, even if the government has to go into debt, it's a worthwhile bargain in order to do it. Okay. All right. So questions about Keynes and what he was up to and his followers. I mentioned some of them. Paul Samuelson's probably his greatest acolyte. He died about 20 years ago. Was at MIT for many years, and I do remember hearing Samuelson say this is the worst thing he ever read, but it was also the most influential thing he ever read. So it is a sort of a difficult thing to get through, but very influential. Kenneth Arrow, who's still around. A lot of these theorists are these so-called saltwater theorists. A lot of them are still around. Some are not, but they're around. Let's talk about the classes now. Unless anybody has any questions about any more on Keynes. So this is, again, based upon some of the original thinking. And this goes back to the idea of efficient markets. The idea that markets work fairly efficiently. Some of the earliest thinking in economics goes back to really Britain and France to some extent, and Germany to some extent, really the 18th century. This is well before the Industrial Revolution got going, but it was the idea of what it means to have freedom to do things economically, and that how markets are really wonderful things. Particularly Adam Smith talked about this. Adam Smith's biggest work was published in 1776, and that might sound like a very important year, but keep in mind, he would have been on the other side of that argument. He was a British subject and did not have a lot of great things to say about his American cousins. And so as a result, he was, and by the way, what's interesting about Smith is today he seems very much middle of the road, fairly conservative, fairly, hodgepodge, pretty acceptable. But he was pretty radical for his time because he was saying, government, let firms and actors do what they want to do. If I want to make candles, let me make candles. I can make as many as I want. I can hire workers. I can expand my operations. I can buy more land in order to expand. And I should be able to do it without government involving itself in the picture. This was a pretty bold thing to say to a fairly authoritarian king at the time, George III, who, frankly, didn't like to be addressed in that manner. And keep in mind that he was already dealing with the American Revolution at the time as well. So you get the idea that it was just there was a lot in the air, and classicism really sort of arose from that. Now, some other thinkers that go into this, you've got Karl Marx, which that sounds like the last thing you'd expect us to hear being lumped together with some of these other theorists, because say what you will about Keynes, he was never a socialist, much less a communist. And Keynes himself was a millionaire investor. He made a fortune trading stocks and currencies and all that. So he, even though he's been associated with being sort of a proto-socialist, that's really a very unfair characterization. And so if Keynes was that, certainly the classists were not. But we put Marx in there because he's got a lot to say, particularly about early industrialization, and some of his observations are very much true. And that was the idea that what industrialization sort of brought to humanity was the essence of competition in daily life, and the idea that we all get up in the morning and we go compete for things all day long, and we're chasing dollars, and some of our relationships with fellow human beings are mostly economic in nature. You can say what you will about some of his other things, but it is interesting to hear some of his observations back then. Among those, when it comes to competition, were the idea that firms will eat each other up, and if you're not a good firm, you'll simply go out of business and be taken over by another business, which today we accept as being pretty middle of the road. That doesn't sound pretty radical to me, but in the 1800s, that probably was something that was considered to be a little bit rude, right? So you're going to get the idea. So it goes way back. David Ricardo was an early economist as well, probably the first true theorist in terms of developing anything like a rigorous economic model of demand and supply. And then some of the later ones, Hayek and Friedman, we talked a bit about. Sometimes these are known as freshwater economists because a lot of the people who hold on to classical views tend to be associated around the Great Lakes region, which is where I'm from, which was where I went as a college and graduate student, and got a lot of my share of classical thinking, even though I don't really consider myself a true classicist. I certainly heard a lot of anti-Keynesian sort of thinking as I was coming up in college and graduate school, both, and University of Chicago, Indiana, where I went. All of these are sort of the focal points for that. So what are some of the tenets of classical theory? Well, if you were to lay side by side those two slides, tenets of Keynesianism and tenets of classical theory, you can see that these differ quite a lot. one of the tenets is that economies are relatively stable because markets themselves are stable. Now, that sounds like it's simply taking a page out of micro and saying, well, markets are mostly stable. Yes, they get out of balance, but when they get out of balance, they get themselves back into balance. They find a new equilibrium level. They do it on their own mostly. They find a new price and a new quantity when something happens to knock them out. Just like we had a spike in gas prices, and gas went to briefly well above $4 per gallon. By the way, the raw material oil went above 140, and now it's back around 102, 103 last I looked at it. And it will probably work its way down below 100 again. That's an individual microeconomic model of a market. And so the thinking was that, well, the economy is the same way. The entire economy will work its way back to full employment if there's an increase in something that throws things off for whatever particular reason. Now, we're either at full employment or we're working our way there. Okay, and then furthermore, the economy is relatively stable. Aggregate demand and aggregate supply are relatively stable. What's not stable is government involvement in the economy, which is due to all kinds of reasons. And that is the idea that government can spend money on whatever purpose, for whatever reason. It can be inflationary. The government can, and in fact, a lot of the current day classicists will criticize lots of government involvement in lots of areas that I think a lot of us would hold near and dear to ourselves, things like Social Security and healthcare spending and higher education spending. And they sort of decry a lot of that involvement, saying government shouldn't get involved at all. Now, if you might remember, now I don't know, I think I'm probably the oldest one here, but I remember when George W. Bush was president in the early 2000s, he proposed the idea of having an alternative system for Social Security, where you could opt out of Social Security, therefore not pay the 6.25% of your income out of your payroll to the government, and that you might get it when you might turn some age, or you might not turn that age, or whatever. Instead, he said, look, you can invest in whatever you want to invest in, bonds or stocks or farmland or whatever. And of course, the opponents of that idea just went berserk, and they thought, no, you mess with Social Security. And I thought it was an interesting idea that at least having a parallel system that you could save for your retirement, and therefore it would be your savings. And I think the critics, and I don't want to dismiss the criticism out of hand, because there are times in which people do lose everything in stocks. They make a lot of horrendous decisions, and it really is not as easy as what it sounds like, despite what a lot of wealthy people will tell you. It's not always that easy. So I understand the criticism, but I thought it was interesting. I thought it deserved some mention. He kind of let it go, though. He didn't sort of run with it. And he picked it back up in his second term early on, and he kind of let that go as well. So but that was the idea but it was embraced, though, at the time by a lot of classicists who said, you know what, Social Security is a terrible program. It's 6.25% of your income, and if you never live to get it, it's just gone forever. If you're married, then your spouse might get some of it. If you have dependents, they'll probably get most of it at some point if you die at a fairly early age. But you don't plan to die, so as a result, you'll get it. And by the way, they keep pushing the retirement age back of quote unquote full benefits. So yes, there's that criticism. That's a really near and dear program, which it's often called the third rail of politics. If you touch it, you're dead, right? So I think President Bush tried it and didn't get very far with it, even though I thought it was an interesting idea. And by the way, I can't say I agree with everything George W. Bush proposed and said, but I thought it was an idea worth looking at, particularly given the fact that when some of these advisors were detailing what it would be like, it was fairly modest. In fact, I don't think people were going to be even allowed to invest in just any startup stock out of wherever, that they would be sort of limited to what they could do with it, and and earn a fairly modest return over time. Okay, all right. So what else? So aggregate demand through government spending is inflationary. That's a problem, and monetary policy is the preferred tool. We talked a bit about the monetary view. So here's the thing: we've already discussed this idea of a vertical long-run aggregate supply curve. Well, where it comes from is this. It really comes from the monetarist view, or the classical view. That's the idea. Full employment is somewhere out here, and that once you get to full employment, any kind of increases in aggregate demand can do this. They're going to do this. They're going to maybe raise GDP a little bit, but they're really going to be very, very, very inflationary. So as a result, these are all aggregate demand curves. All these are aggregate demand, all these are. So stimulating the economy through aggregate demand doesn't really do much to boost GDP. What it does do is raise the price level. And the idea is that this is why you've got a vertical long-run supply curve, and that just simply by adding government spending doesn't do anything. And that, in fact, if it does boost GDP, it's a little bit, but it's more than offset by the increase in prices. And so as a result of this, we can say that we've got this area of the aggregate supply curve is called the Keynesian region or Keynesian area. And this is sometimes known as the classical region. And by the way, when we talk about this idea of long and short run, I think that Keynesianism is oftentimes viewed as a short-term model for what to do if and when an economy needed a little bit of boosting, a little bit of a jump start, a little bit of a kick. And in the long run, the classicists are saying, let's move GDP this direction, but do it very carefully. We move the whole thing, demand, supply together. So we have growth, but we have growth without inflation, because again, we come back to what is the main goal of macro policy? Non-inflationary economic growth. That's the main goal. And the classicists believe they've got sort of the secret sauce. And that is to not engage in lots of excessive government spending, which, by the way, are fueled with taxation, which slows the economy down anyway. And so you slow the economy down, you don't get much GDP growth, but you just add to inflation. And that the more the government raises in taxes, the more it will spend. And they'll already keep spending, even independent of taxes, because of this notion of government spending. And they have lots of implicit criticism for Keynes and all of his discussions, really sort of ignoring the fact that he was talking about a really deep depression at the time. But you know, when Keynes says things like, it doesn't matter what government spends money on in order to raise GDP, that it would be better if the government hired 50 people in the first shift to dig a hole and 50 people in the second shift to fill the hole back up. It's still better than doing nothing, right? Well, that, you know, obviously to the critics, they have a field day with that. That's a government policy. It's a government program if I ever saw one, right? As people would talk about. So it's this idea of, you know, government spending that makes sense is okay, but unfortunately, who knows what makes sense? So as a result of this, it's difficult to know what spending is important. And so restricting the role of government spending and creating things like a balanced budget would be very helpful. And that was last week's discussion, wasn't it? Balanced budget. And by the way, we come back to this idea of rules versus discretion. We talked about rules-based monetary policy with the K% rule, and which is sometimes called the monetary price rule. It's the same thing. Monetary price rule and the K% rule is the same thing. We also talked a bit about the Taylor rule. There have been few efforts to really have rules-based fiscal policy. The one that I can remember is something called the Graham-Rudman Act in about 1985. It said that government had to have a balanced budget. But if it did not have a balanced budget, then here were the cuts that were to be made the next year. Boom, 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 in this percentage. That's rules-based fiscal policy if I ever saw it. That is, if we run a deficit, then we're going to pay for it next year because we're going to cut education spending, healthcare, we're going to cut defense, we're going to cut whatever. The only thing I think that was sacred was interest on the debt, which if the government stops paying interest on its debt, that's game over, I think, really. So nobody wanted that. But the Graham-Rudman law didn't last very long. It was big and controversial. It was in the times in which people were really concerned about and thinking that the deficit was a bigger deal than maybe what it turns out to have been. But the idea was that let's do something about it. But as it turns out, that was too difficult. That particular rule was just too difficult. So as a result, that was sort of abandoned. Okay. All right. So any questions from me? I've only got a couple more topics to talk about. I think, would it bother anybody if we don't take a break and we just sort of wrap it up and say a little after 7? Does that sound agreeable, acceptable? Thumbs up, thumbs down?
Sounds good.
Okay, all right, okay, good. Because that's all so because it looks like we've been sort of running behind throughout the term. But I knew we would be at this point where we'd be okay on where we're going to end up. So I got two more things to talk about, both of which are subsets of the classical school, which by the way is large. I mean, we're talking about the classicists and sort of the latter day classes is what we call neoclassists for the most part, particularly those who fall into these last two groups. And the first is what's called supply-siders. Supply-side economics, which by the way is not really, it's one of those deals where it's like nothing is really new, it's just sort of recycled, kind of like the the so-called equation of exchange, the MV equals PQ, is not really new. It was sort of recycled. Well, supply side theory, which really adheres to classical orthodoxy in many ways, really, Keynes was one of the first to talk about this idea of tax policy and what tax policy could and could not do. And the idea was that it's really focused on tax policy. And the fact is that what the classicists have long been critical of fiscal policy in general, that is excessive government spending on the one hand, but on the other side of the equation, excessive taxation. And what if we did both? What if we lowered government spending and lowered taxation? Therefore, more resources would be available to the private sector in order to do what? To build up the supply of goods. And so it would make firms be more able to take risks because they knew that they'd be able to hold more of their earnings without getting it taxed away. By the way, supply side economics and the idea behind it really informed the last major revision of the tax code, which was done in 2017. President Trump signed the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, which was very much a supply side idea. And that was the idea that we would cut the corporate tax rate dramatically, I mean, just a huge corporate tax cut. And a lot of us were in favor of a cutting the corporate tax rate. I don't know that I thought it was ever going to go that low, 21%. That's lower than a lot of individuals pay by far than what a lot of individuals pay. But it was an effort to sort of boost the supply side of the economy, which we tend to be associated with firms, although supply siders will also say it's not just firms, because keep in mind, households are also suppliers. They supply labor, and sometimes they even start their own businesses. And that's where businesses start, as individuals. And so it really empowers individuals if we can reduce taxes and reduce the role of government. And it's not just the fiscal policy side of taxation, but it's also regulation. And so putting those together is so-called taxulation is sort of the bugaboo. It's the boogeyman that they don't like. Both of which are associated with government. Too much taxes, too much regulation, all of which increases the cost of doing business, which makes it hard for businesses to want to do things. And I think there's a lot of support for that idea. You may not agree with it, and there are parts of it I don't agree with it as well, but if you consider the fact that a lot of drug development in this country lags the rest of the world by some time, because it takes so long to get new drugs approved. And I know that we worked fairly quickly. I know that the Trump administration worked very hard, what they called Operation Warp Speed, to get COVID vaccines done. That was pretty good. You have to give credit for that. But in general, it takes longer in the US to get drugs approved. Sometimes the drugs never do get approved and people go to other countries to get treatment. I know the football player Peyton Manning had to have a particular surgical operation that was not approved in this country, and it didn't look like he was going to get approved. And so I think he went to Switzerland to have it done. And we're not talking about going to some third world country to have some sort of schlocky operation. We're talking about a very wealthy individual in a very high pressure sport. So you get the idea that is one example. Lots of people in industry will think that they are just the most regulated industry of all. I know my sister worked in the pharmaceutical industry. I thought they were the most regulated. I worked in banking for years, and a lot of my peers thought, oh, we're just incredibly regulated. And in fact, what's really interesting is that President Obama, who probably was not much of a friend of supply side economics, was asked in a conference, and I think I may have mentioned this, that what if we got rid of half the regulations, we'd probably be okay. And he said, no, maybe not half, or maybe a quarter, which I thought he was maybe shooting from the hip, and maybe it was a rather glib statement, but I thought it was interesting that he would even admit that there was a substantial amount of regulation that could go away. But nonetheless, you get the idea that removing government from such an active involvement in life was what they were really going for. But tax policy is really sort of the centerpiece. And so there was something called the Laffer Curve, which was developed by a guy named Arthur Laffer, who is still around. He was at the University of Southern California, then made his way to the University of Chicago, a freshwater school eventually. Today, I think he runs an investment firm. I think he lives in Tennessee now, but he's still around. He himself was very popular on TV in the early 80s, and he was very influential at forming a lot of the basis behind President Reagan's efforts at what can be called supply side economics. Laffer Curve looks at, well, first of all, what are the axes here? So the axes are, on the one axis, tax revenue expressed in dollar terms. So that's a dollar figure. Then the tax rate, which is expressed on the horizontal axis, the so-called marginal tax rate here, which is not one rate. Marginal taxes work, the more you earn, the more you pay as a percentage of tax. It's graduated based upon how much is earned both in corporate and individual taxes. Well, it was in those days. Now we've got sort of a flat tax on corporate income, at least at the moment. But here's the idea. And by the way, you can invert these axes and the curve will be the same. So the curve looks something like this. And if you were to invert the axis, the curve would look like that. So you sometimes see it that way. I don't recall offhand how your text has it, but it's the same idea. So what Arthur Laffer was saying was that we were somewhere out here in the late 1970s, where some individuals with very high income paid up to around 70% marginal tax rate and whatnot, so made them unlikely to invest, unlikely to buy a house because they didn't have enough, of disposable income to do that. Didn't want to start a business because they didn't want to pay high taxes on earnings. And so the idea was that you're going to earn some sort of tax revenue. We'll call that revenue zero, and tax is T0 there. What he was suggesting was that if we simply lower taxes, it will actually end up raising more in government revenue. And so as a result, by taking the tax rate down, government will actually raise more. I got this sort of jammed up here, don't I? The government will actually earn more if all we do is cut taxes. Because why? What's the mechanism? What is the transmission mechanism? And what he's saying is that by lowering taxes, it encourages risk taking, frankly, and that if it's just another cost of doing business, if the cost of business is lower, then it makes firms more likely to create new products, to expand plants and inventory and hire workers and take risks and to do those kinds of things. And so as a result, that boosts aggregate demand, that boosts income, and that boosts tax revenue. So if government is taking too big a share of the pie, if we take some of the pie away from government, then the private sector could do its job. And by the way, government itself will benefit as a result of this. This was the thinking, and apparently this was first concocted on a cocktail napkin in a bar in Washington, D.C. And it turns out it was Dick Cheney's cocktail napkin who later became vice president. But Keynes was really talked a little bit about this in the general theory, but this was the orthodoxy that justified President Reagan's very steep tax cuts in his first term. Here's the problem with the Laffer curve, is the idea that it probably is not true. This probably is not a very firm relationship. I can tell you that I had dug up a textbook that was published in 1984. That was the end of Reagan's first term, and it talked about the Laffer curve, saying it appears not to be right. It appears not to be right. Now, it was written by a couple of freshwater economists at MIT, but it did not appear to be right. And in fact, we keep hearing, now, why do I teach a theory that tends not to be right and is still sort of debunked? It's because this idea comes up again and again and again among primarily legislators who are very pro-business in the first place, who say the government will raise more revenue, all we got to do is cut taxes. And there are perennially members of Congress who will always argue that taxes should be cut. It's almost like a doctrine of faith. We just need to cut taxes. Taxes are too high. We need to cut them, and that the problems will be solved. And I don't think that it's sort of given up the ghost really on this whole idea of revenue. But that was some of the justification for getting it sold in the first place. We know that tax revenues did not rise materially during that first administration of Ronald Reagan. In fact, he knew it. And in fact, in the second term, President Reagan signed off on a very large tax increase, much of which is still in place for individuals. The corporate code has been revised very substantially under President Trump, which, by the way, was influenced a lot by Laffer Curve thinking. But the individual code, for the most part, that President Reagan signed off on in 1986, is for the most part still around, and it raised tax rates. Now, they've been tinkered with and adjusted over time. And there was a time when I think in the Reagan years, I think they took it down to 3 marginal rates for individuals. Since then, it's been adjusted and graduated a number of times, but the basic idea and that major revision is mostly intact. The big changes for individuals that the 2017 Act brought about was a change in the child tax credit, some of the changes in deductibility of things on itemized deductions, a big increase in standard deduction. Those are some of the major things, and some things which you couldn't deduct that you used to be able to, but those were fairly minor, really, compared to some of the changes on the corporate side. Okay. So anyway, that's the reason we talk about it, is because it still is talked about today. One final bit, and that's something called the Ret theory, which is also associated with, I'm going to leave this, I'll leave this, which is associated with neoclassical thinking. So rational expectations theory is interesting, and there's a lot of elements to it. And in fact, even the Keynesians themselves have a sort of a variation on the theme of rational expectations. And when we say it's a theory, that's probably not the right word. It's really a set of theories And in fact, it may not even be that. Maybe it's more of a kind of a general worldview as one of those how the world works kind of things. Okay, and let me describe what it's one of these ideas that kind of go along the lines of the world is not the way we think it is, and so things are not what you think they are. That is the idea that that when policy is done, particularly in an interconnected world like ours, when policy, whether it's fiscal policy or monetary policy, that people who are rationally expecting what is to come will take steps in order to negate the effectiveness of the policy in the first place. Ergo, therefore, the government policy is largely ineffective, particularly when people know about it. And in fact, and I mentioned this last time, there is a set of theories, which goes back to this RET theory, that says that monetary policy in particular is most effective when it surprises the public. I mentioned that last week, when it surprises the public. That's right out of the work of Robert Lucas, who was really sort of the main character here. It was the University of Minnesota, then University of Chicago, won Nobel Prize for his contributions to RET theory. And it basically is the idea that policy doesn't work because private actors won't let it work. So let's take a couple examples here. One of the ones that Lucas talked about was this idea of a government policy which was set to raise taxes. Okay, so if government was going to raise taxes, then that workers would demand wage increases. As workers demanded wage increases, business firms would cut back on hiring as a result of that. So as a result, the government wanted to raise taxes in order to raise more revenue, but couldn't do it because the economy is going to be slowing down because workers were demanding wage increases and they vote with their feet. They don't really demand it, they just simply move elsewhere. And business firms then slow down hiring, slow down expanding because they don't know what's coming. And in fact, what does come is a recession, and the recession there inherently reduces tax revenues. So the goal to raise tax revenues is outweighed by the fact that tax revenues will be going down because of a recession. Or if it's considered to be inflationary, that if workers do get a wage increase, then firms will back off on supplying anyway. So you have this leftward shift to aggregate supply, and it sort of wipes out the gains that might have been gained to GDP and tax revenue in that regard. Okay, so that's a little bit, and that is the precise scenario that is talked about in the McConnell text. Let me give you at least one other example there, and that's a little bit more micro in nature because it deals with goods taxes. But there was I remember the state where I grew up used to have an inventory tax. This is probably an easier example. It was an inventory tax. So if you were a seller of goods, you had to pay a tax on all your inventory. As of I think it was usually November 30th. And the government thought they were being very smart by saying, okay, November 30th, that's when firms are getting lots of inventory in because they want the stuff on stock so that when Christmas shoppers come in, it's there. And so as a result, we'll tax them when it's there. So if you have appliances or furniture or automobiles or whatever, those dealers and all those sellers will pay a tax. So that will raise a bunch of revenue for the state. Well, what happened was this: basically, November 30th would come around. Every seller of any kind of goods, with furniture stores, sporting goods stores, retailers of all kinds, car dealers, furniture stores, would say, "Big inventory clearance sale, come get it!" Big bold shouting at you on TV. So everybody knew to go buy a couch or a washing machine, do it in November in that second half of the month, because otherwise, that's when they were marking those goods down. They were trying to discount. They would rather have their customers take the discount and they clear the items off than to pay the tax, even though the tax was not a gigantic tax. But they would rather sell the goods rather than pay the tax. So everybody decided they would go buy the inventory. And so as a result, what happened? These firms were wiped out of goods on November 30th. And so you might think, well, what do they do for Christmas? Well, they just restock quickly enough for Christmas in order to avoid that particular problem. So that it didn't raise very much tax. It certainly didn't raise as much as was expected because of the fact that it was a gimmick. It always sounded to me like a gimmick until I had to go buy something, and then I saw all the sellers were offering inventory clearance sales simply because of that one unique state's tax on inventory. And so the purpose of the tax to raise revenue was negated by the very actions which private actors took, both buyers and sellers, in order to negate the effectiveness of the tax. And by the way, all these actors that we've been talking about in the examples, they're not being unpatriotic or they're not anti-government, but they are acting in their own self-interest, which is really, after all, some of the idea behind classical thinking is the idea that private actors left their own devices are better off in meeting big brother in the form of government to help them. So that was one particular example. One other example, this will be my last point. The one that I can think of was a tax on luxury goods. And I think it was a luxury tax around 1990, I want to say. So if you bought a good that was open, it took effect like January 1st, 1990 or 91, something like that. So if you bought like a good over 35,000, seems to be, so a Cadillac or a Jaguar or a houseboat or whatever, you would end up paying a luxury tax on that. So what did everybody do if they knew they were going to buy a Cadillac or a Corvette or a luxury good? They would buy it before the tax. And I remember I was in banking at the time making all these loans on Cadillacs and Corvettes and houseboats and you name it, expensive motorcycles like Harley Davidsons, anything over $35,000. Maybe not so much the Harley Davidsons, but big expensive items. And so what happened was January 1st rolled around, people were done. Anybody who had a decision to make knew that tax was coming. It was well publicized. We're a very much interconnected world. And so it never raised very much revenue because everyone sort of beat the tax because they knew it was coming. So the purpose of the tax to raise revenue was negated by the fact that people were taking steps to act in their own self-interest rather than in the public interest, which is not their realm. And the classicists are very clear that the private sector, they're dealing with their own particular sets of priorities, and the public sector, public is not really their concern. Milton Friedman himself said that businesses, and again, he was used to pushing people's buttons, the businesses have only one goal in mind, and that is to maximize the returns to owners, that their job is not to worry about unemployment, their job is not to worry about the environment, their job is not to worry about world peace, any of those kinds of things. Now today, I think that view is probably not as conventionally held because corporations are very active in all these areas of social life and whatnot. But you get the idea that that was sort of a conventional viewpoint among classical economic thinkers. Let private actors do their thing free from government interference. Everybody's better off. And by the way, the RET theorists believe policy is futile in the first place because it will ultimately fail because people will take steps to negate its happening. And certainly, I think we have seen this in the bond market because the bond market has well anticipated interest rate increases by the Federal Reserve, which are going to come next month, it looks like, in the month of May. So they have sort of telegraphed that, and the market has already reacted. That's an example of the RET theory at work, okay? And there are lots of different elements and pieces of this that we can go into. I just gave you a bit of an introduction to it in case you ever, if you're interested in it some more. There's a lot of information out there available. So anyway, are there questions for me about anything that I have talked about so far tonight or any time in the class since you've known me or whatever? Okay, well, we're about done. Only thing we have to do is this week's discussion activity, and everything should be returned to you up to week 5. I know that a couple of people reached out to me about why some of those discussions hadn't been returned. And mostly it's because people were still posting, and I realized I was talking to one of our associate deans about the fact that you guys are the last cohort that is the COVID variety, where I know that we were sort of encouraged to give students flexibility to due dates and whatnot, given all the sort of unique circumstances. The fact that we're not meeting in person is one. So I didn't really deduct anything for late posts or posts on different days or anything like that. So I sort of let some of that go, but I realized you need to get feedback too. So there's a trade-off, and it wasn't really clear what the trade-off should be. Should it be for more flexibility, or should it be for feedback? It doesn't take very long. I mean, only 8 of it. So it wasn't a case in which I was putting it off. I just didn't know what the trade-off was. It's much easier to go back and it's hard for me to pick out new posts. I have to go through it individually to see. So it's just easier to grade them at once. So that should all be back. I'll be looking week 6 is this week sometime, and then week 7 probably sometime on Monday, and I'll post the final grades. So discussion activity is this week's activity. The final exam is done. Let me post it. I'll make it available probably tomorrow. Okay. Give it to tomorrow, maybe later in the day. I want to look at it, make some tweaks to it. I just want to be sure that I didn't include anything in there that I didn't talk about, or maybe that I didn't think was emphasized enough. And I may alter it a little bit. It'll be available through Sunday in Brightspace for you to take. And I'll give you, again, the same 2 chances, same 2 opportunities to do it. I didn't look and see how many people tried to take it twice last time. I mean, it's a lot. It's a 2-hour exam, so it's a lot. It may not be in your plans to try to take the exam twice, and so I get that, but it is available if you do want to see it. a second time. So I'll make it available, but it'll probably be available sometime tomorrow. It'll be available through Sunday, and it'll turn off of that. And then Monday, it'll be just a day that I prepare grades for all of my sections. And so you probably won't really have any time to make anything up at that point. And but that'll be it. That'll be it for the semester, and that'll be it for your program, because you guys are done, right? You're all done. Okay, and so we have a shindig on Friday, right? I think that's what it is. So it used to be in person. It used to have a really nice dinner in person. I don't think we're doing it that this way right now still, but that's unfortunate because that was always a lot of fun. But COVID did what it did. So anyway, so I'm gonna sort of end it right here. I hope anyone's not too overly disappointed that we're gonna end early tonight, but I got through everything I wanted to talk about. So if you do have anything for me, I'll hang around for a bit, or I'm available all week. If you do have questions for me, just feel free to call me or email me, or however you want to reach me. I'm around all the time. So I'll hang around on Zoom for a bit. Otherwise, that'll be it for now. And I'll see you guys on Friday then. So, okay.
Great, thank you.
All right,
Thank
bye-bye.
you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye, guys.